It's Christmas time, and we all know the problem. You get a complete Panzergrenadier Company with half-tracks as a gift, and suddenly you are acting company commander. Overwhelmed by gratitude and responsibility, you look like a little puppy at your parents. But don't worry, I got your flank covered. Here's a translation of the 30 commandments for the commander of the Panzergrenadier Company Armored, right out of the bulletin for the Panzerwaffe No. 1 from July 1943. Of course, I provided some additional context if deemed necessary. So lean back, grab a plate of cookies with a glass of milk, and enjoy. First off, there were several variants of the Panzergrenadier Company in 1943. In general, they had about 200 men and 20 half-tracks. Now let's get started with commandment number 1. Before the start of the march, copy the march route yourself from the map for each of your platoon leaders and vehicle echelon leaders. The greatest misunderstandings can occur with Russian place names due to listening errors. Now this is how you properly subvert someone's expectations. At least I assume you didn't expect the first commandment to be about marching. Yet this is crucial, because you don't want to get your unit lost or split up for many reasons, ranging from wasting time and resources or endangering your men and equipment. For instance, running into partisans, minefields or bad terrain. How central marching was is also reflected by the Army regulation for the Panzergrenadier-Battaillon from 1944. The section about the march covers almost 8 pages of the 145. That might not seem much, but the attack covers about the same number of pages in the manual. Don't worry, combat will also be covered in many commandments later. Yet commandment number 2 is also about the march. Second, keep your communication forwards and backwards. A company arriving a little later but altogether is worth more than a company commander standing alone in the meadow. This principle is also related to combat as well, where you don't want to commit your forces in piecemeal fashion, but as a combined force. Well, the prerequisite for that is that all are at the same place to begin with. This leads directly into commandment number 3. The slowest vehicle, if it is absolutely necessary for combat, determines the speed of a company. Position is behind the commander's vehicle. This situation could arise from a vehicle having engine problems or being worn out. Additionally, the SdKfz 251 came in many different variants. For instance, one with the short-barreled 75mm gun. Such vehicles likely might have been slower. Furthermore, the Germans often used captured vehicles as well, and certain vehicles from other units might be attached to the company also. Commandment number 4 is about the individual vehicle commanders. Fourth, the vehicle commanders observe standing even during storms and at night. Experience has shown that the seated commander neglects observation. This is important since technically the seat next to the driver in the front of the SdKfz 51 was the vehicle's commander's seat. Which leads to number 5. When passing through narrow and poor roadways, the commanders instruct their vehicles while dismounted. Not much to add here. So up to number 6. If there are supply trains with the company, always use half-tracks as tail vehicles. They make trucks that get stuck afloat, pick up the crew of broken down vehicles, and secure backwards. Now, due to the capabilities in terms of protection, power and storage, half-tracks are used to make sure that nothing of the trains gets left behind. Commandment number 7 builds directly upon this. If the road conditions are bad, divide your entire trains and the motorcycles with sidecar individually between half-tracks and free the tow ropes. In the case of trucks, put the rope on the front axle, in the case of motorcycles on the sidecar strut. Medium motorcycles, which are motorcycles without a sidecar, are loaded onto the vehicles. Note that the Germans had a rather weak automobile industry, but a strong motorcycle industry. As such, the Germans used quite many motorcycles, and a motorcycle with a sidecar was usually equipped with a machine gun as well. Commandment 8 is about march discipline and how to enforce it. Your most energetic officer leads at the end of your company. He prevents unauthorized overtaking. Behind him there's also a solo motorcycle, which comes forward from time to time and reports the distances and breakdowns. Another motorcycle rider keeps up at large distances at the end of the forward unit with the person in front and reports the march route at intersections. To give you some idea how long a Panzergrenadier Company approximately was, according to a manual from 1944 it was 790 meters, with a spacing distance of 25 meters between each vehicle. Note, this likely refers to a different layout than the ones mentioned above, yet the differences should be limited. Similarly, Commandment 9 is all about keeping your column free from other units. Throw single vehicles from different units ruthlessly out of your column and let them follow at the end, otherwise they will turn somewhere and with them your whole remaining column. And in case you thought that the vastness of the Eastern Front might have prevented traffic jams, well, Commandment 10 doesn't agree. Fight meter by meter of advancement in marching holdups. It costs fuel and engines. Let the unit in the front of you drive away quietly until it reaches viewing distance and only then drive off yourself. All units behind you are grateful. Remember, however, that you are responsible for the contact to your commander and use your motorcycle messengers for this. Of course, the reason and how to deal with traffic jams was a bit different back then. 11. At marching holdups, every leader belongs forward to the underlying cause. Usually a driver has fallen asleep. Note, the first sentence sounds also rather weird in German as well. And speaking of falling asleep, number 12, during night drives with many stops form a wake-up command from your motorcyclists. Each time you start, they will wake up and your column will remain together. Also instruct the unit behind you that it's time to move on. Now, current and former service members are probably not surprised at all about this. Yet for those who didn't serve, here a bit of information how sleeping in the military works. Note, this is based on personal experience, but every time I ask a former service member about this, they basically agreed or shared a similar story. In the military, if someone is sitting in a moving vehicle and is not assigned a task, he or she usually falls asleep within a few minutes. This is due to most people lacking sleep or having acquired this behavior in boot camp, where everyone lacks sleep. So yeah, in the military you usually take any chance to sleep. Yeah, let's move on. 13. Tactical leaders have no business at the steering wheel. This just stressed how important leading your troops is. Additionally, back then vehicles were usually harder to drive, manual gear shift and likely with far lesser tolerances than nowadays as well. This is comparable to the 3-man turret on tanks that became common in World War II. Since the main job of the commander was leading observation and communication, not firing the gun. The next one is 14. When passing through hollow paths and depressions, individual vehicles are positioned at the flank, which observe over the cover. Radio communication. Well, always cover your flanks. And when it comes to resting, 15. During concealed disposition in the forest, it is better to be 50 meters too far inside than 1 centimeter too far outside. In the army regulations and everywhere else, a particular importance for mechanized troops was given to the protection against aerial observation. For instance, a common example was to park the vehicles in the shadow of the trees and buildings, not just next to them. Another common measure was covering up the track marks of the tanks. Well, the antidote to camouflage is reconnaissance. 16. Single vehicles that were sent on patrol you will only see again under lucky circumstances. Every swamp, every fly in the carburetor means it's lost, so always send 2 or more. This was quite surprising for me at first. Then again, the reliability of World War II vehicles was quite different from what we experience nowadays. Additionally, the conditions at the front line are usually way harsher than in civilian life. And yes, there are also people shooting at you, and the German High Command in 1942 stressed that on the Eastern Front recon units require proper firepower. Something discussed recently on my second channel. Speaking of recon, 17. Never use your company without terrain reconnaissance. Terrain recon is crucial since any obstacle in a combat situation can develop into a death trap. Even for a well-armored vehicle like a tank, as half-tracks were not well-armored, the Sonderkraftfahrzeug 251 had protection only against small arms fire, namely 14.5 mm in the front and 8 mm on the hull side. As such, speed, mobility and terrain features was the source of protection for the half-track, which is also expressed in the next commandment. 18. Use the speed and firepower of your heavy weapons to advance and prevent losses. Now, in terms of heavy weapons, a company in early 1943 had heavy machine guns, 37mm anti-tank guns, and 81mm mortars. Yet in late 1943, the 75mm short barrel guns were added to the heavy platoon. As such, the company had a good combination of direct and indirect fire weapons at its disposal. Now, one of the key missions of Panzergrenadiere was to support tanks in combat. As such, it was important to stay close and protect them against enemy infantry and other threats that are hard to spot. But staying close to tanks is quite dangerous because they tracked a lot of fire. 19. When attacking behind tanks, set yourself apart from the tanks when passing through the barrage area. These draw the massed artillery fire on itself. Move up with maximum speed. If the last parts of the tank wave break into the main line of resistance. The Russian has many anti-tank rifles, which, experience has shown, come to life when the tanks have passed. Note that the Sonderkraftfahrzeug 251 was especially vulnerable to Soviet anti-tank rifles. Yet, let's move on to the next one. 20. Support the tanks at close range with all weapons when fighting in the enemy main defensive area. Don't forget the protection backwards. Not much to add here. Now, if you thought that the driver had an easy job, well, 21. The submachine gun of the driver should not rust in its holder. It is a valuable weapon in close combat from the vehicle. And if other documents are a good indication, this was not uncommon, even for drivers in more heavily armored vehicles like the Sturmgeschütze. To quote from a leaflet by the Sturmgeschützschule, for close range defense, he always carries a submachine gun at hand, with which he can also shoot out of the observation slit. If you want to learn more, be sure to check out my Zug School video, by the way. On to commandment number 22. Rear vehicles should not endanger the crew of front vehicles which are fighting over the side with their fire. Note, in the first years of the war, the doctrine stated the Panzergrenadiere should fight dismounted, yet around 1942, mounted combat had become regular. The next one is an evergreen. 23. Driving a lane if there is danger of mines. Why is this an evergreen? Well, because it's basically stated everywhere. As such, I have to assume that it was probably not followed that strictly. Well, commandment number 24 is about weaknesses and strengths. Any armored piercing weapon is superior to you in combat readiness. Balance this with high speed, terrain utilization, short firing stops, and energetic fire concentration. At the shortest distance, overrun detected anti-tank guns while firing at them. Since the art of not being seen doesn't really work when you are attacking with a half-track, it becomes the art of not being hit. Also keep the suppression on the enemy up. Next is 25. Dismount only when enemy anti-tank gun fire or the terrain forces you to do so. And no bypass is possible. Always use your armor protection. It saves a lot of blood. As mentioned previously, mounted combat was not the norm early on. This had changed during the course of the war, and this statement clearly reflects that. It is important to point out that usually a Panzer division ran out of Panzergrenadiere before they ran out of tanks. As such, often regular infantry had to be used to support the Panzers. And this was usually not working out, since regular infantry overestimated the capabilities of the Panzers and was oblivious to their limits. Number 26 is about defense. If you set up a hedgehog position with your vehicles, then secure yourself at night by advanced patrols. Let the engines run for 15 minutes from time to time so they are warm when you want to fight mounted. If the enemy attacks, clear the firing zone of your own forces and take advantage of your mobility. This is interesting from many aspects. First, it seems that noise camouflage was less important than to have a warmed up engine. Second, a defense with moving not dug in vehicles is recommended. Then again, digging in vehicles likely would have taken too long. Still, for me the recommendation was quite unexpected. Well, the next one is less surprising. 27. Do not install reserved jerry cans for fuel outside the sidewalls. Every tracer ignites. Yet a good reminder that the obvious can sometimes be forgotten. I assume this mostly happened since the storage within the hard tracks was very limited and generally people don't want to have a jerry can of fuel next to them. And the best way to prevent this is to mount them outside. Additionally, the Germans also use the same jerry cans for water, but with different markings. Commandment number 28 is a good reminder on how Germans fought in World War II. Offensively. In defense, the vehicles shall be kept covered and at least kept together as platoons, so that the man with driver and gunner can effectively line up for a hasty counterattack. After all, a defense without some kind of counterattack is not a real defense. Note that the Gegenstoß is a hasty counterattack, whereas a Gegenangriff is a deliberate or planned counterattack, as pointed out by Condell and Zabecki. Remember, be precise in your speech. And the last two commandments are about communications. 29. Use a radio sparingly. With the engine stopped, it drains the battery in 5 hours. If you still need it, let the engine run for 15 minutes every hour. Think about this the next time you complain about your smartphone running out of power. And finally, your radio communications will only be of use to you when the commanders have equipped the receiver and throat microphone. Otherwise, the warning of enemy anti-tank guns often comes too late. In other words, listening to the radio was a bit like wearing a seatbelt, where a minor change can have strong consequences. Time for a short conclusion. Now, I did not do an extensive analysis, but I casually categorized the commandments. While some are clear-cut, some are less so, nevertheless I think there's a clear theme here. About 11 deal with marching, about 10 deal with combat, and around 3 deal with both. Whereas 2 deal with communications, 1 with storage, 1 with recon, 1 with resting, and 1 with camouflage. Which clearly shows that there was an emphasis on marching and combat. The second one is not so surprising, the first one clearly was, at least for me. Furthermore, the overall structure is not arbitrary, similar to German army regulations where the march is usually before the combat in the table of contents. The commandments seem to follow a chronological structure as well, basically beginning with the handing out of the information before the march to the various platoon leaders. And commandment 15 deals with positioning the half-tracks during a rest or after the march, which then leads into the recon and combat commandments. Another interesting tidbit is also the only location mentioned is Russia, aka the Soviet Union, which also underlines that this was the main front line for the Germans. Additionally, these commandments were published in mid-July 1943, basically during Operation Husky, which was the Western Allied invasion of Sicily. Well, now if you get your Panzergrenadier Company for Christmas, you know what to do, namely, don't get lost in the Soviet Union. Anyway, I wish you all a Merry Christmas and a Metal New Year. As usual, I will take a short break and likely will report back in late January 2020. Also, a big thank you here to Malte and Philip for sending me books that were used in this video. Also, a big thank you to everyone who supports or supported me on Patreon, Subscribestar or PayPal. As always, source list in the description. Thank you for watching and see you in 2020.